Welcome, everyone. Hello, I'm very happy that you join us for the presentation of our special issue of the journal Osteuropa Recht. The special issue discusses the implementation and the controversies around the Istanbul Convention, the Council of Europe's Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence against Women and Domestic Violence in Central and Eastern Europe. And it's striking that the resistance and protest to the convention is particularly strong in that region. The journal was already published some months ago, but with the Russian invasion against Ukraine, as it was a major topic during the last months, we postponed the presentation, but we think it's still relevant today and we are happy to discuss it now. It's available online within the NOMES e-library. Yeah, my name is Caroline von Gaal. I was the editor of that special issue, and I still remember the moment when I thought it would be interesting to discuss it a little further, because I was looking on a map, and the map was showing the progress and the implementation, the efforts of the implementation of the convention in Europe as a whole. And on the map you could see that there is something special about Eastern Europe and Eastern European countries with regard to the convention. Not all of the Eastern European states are reluctant to join and to implement, but many of them. And so we wondered what it is about. But before I say a few more words, I would like to introduce the authors that have their articles within the issue. It's Monika Płatek, who's a law professor at Warsaw University and a prominent women's rights campaigner. Then there is Mariana Muraeva. Hello. She's a professor of Russian law and administration at Helsinki University with a specialization in women's rights and violence against women. Timi Adrinosi is a professor at the Faculty of Law of the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. And Lydia Balog, who's the co-author of the article on Hungary, is a research fellow at the Center of Social Sciences at the Institute of Legal Studies in Budapest. And then there is Radosveta Vasilyeva, who is a visiting research fellow at Middlesex University and a legal expert working on Bulgaria. Then there's also Ivana Markovits, who presented her article in the special issue, and Anna Novitskaya, who's also there. Is there anyone else? There's Maya Munibrana, who also contributed to this issue. Hello, everyone, and thank you for participation. Of course, there is already a lot of literature, or there was already a lot of literature on the discussion of women's rights and anti-genderism, conservatism in Eastern Europe, but very much it's most of all very much from the perspective of sociology and political studies. And in our special issue, we wanted to shed light on the legal discussion in these countries and how legal instruments are used in the contestation progress, especially, of course, how courts deal with this issue and have a special focus on that legal perspective. In the end, of course, the picture is very diverse. You can see it from the articles that there are very different approaches, and it's not all Eastern European in the same way. But there are. It's not always contestation, but there are, of course, countries who are very much following the process of the Council of Europe. So there are there is very much diversity among the states. That is very interesting to see, and we can also only here look on some countries and look on some articles that are in the issue. And that's what we want to do now. We want to have very short presentations of some articles and then answer your question, do a little, have a little comparative look on the articles and look what has happened since the time the articles were written and published and what can be done, of course, in the future. Yeah, so we would like to start, or I would like to start, yeah, where shall we start? Actually, maybe we start with Monica and the Polish case, if you would like. So Monica, you have...
Okay, thank you very much, and really thank you very much for this possibility to discuss it with all of you. I will present, I was asked to talk only for 5 minutes, which is a challenge because usually it takes 90 minutes. Therefore, I would stress myself to mainly 3 points, and maybe I'm wrong, but this is how I would like to present. First of all, I think that I would like to question 2 premises that were done at the very beginning in Caroline paper. The first premise was that the International Women's Rights was strongly celebrated in a previous time. Well, I think that this is a false premise, or at least the premise which is looking at the situation from the very formal point of view. Women's rights were formally celebrated. They were not actually practiced, and it is very quickly visible after 89, and that's the part of the process where we have at the very beginning the parliamentary women group. For the first time, women in the parliament demand a voice. Second, it's the very 8th of March day, which stopped being the day when the women are getting the little flower and the pants, but starts to be a demonstration and the presentation of a real actually problems that are first this happening only in Warsaw, which is capital of Poland, then it spread all over country. The next movement is the movement of the Congress of Women, which is created in 2009, where actually after the moment when we celebrate the new reality which happened in Poland after 89, and in the panel, there are just men, no women at all. And this is the moment when again, we realize how far women are treated in a very cerebral, but not certain, but not the part which take the women's problem into agenda and treats them seriously. So the first thing is that we need 89, we need the change of regime to realize 2 things. First of all, that women have no rights. Second, that women do grow in power and demand to be treated equally. And equally does not mean as men. Equally means that our rights, our needs, our experience must be taken into consideration. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I would question that this is an Eastern European problem. And here I would send all of us to Neil Data presentation, which is the EU representatives for gender and sexual rights, showing that actually the process starts somewhere in Brazil in 1960s and spread very strongly. And that is a serious matter because it is something that is questioning not only women's rights, it is questioning human rights. It is questioning the rights of people to actually not only have human rights in paper, but exercise them, demand the states to exercise them towards the individual people. So the process that starts in Eastern European countries is starting in Eastern European countries because of the experience of being under Soviet regime and experiencing the lack of power and the lack of stability. So that might be the point. But the whole process is spreading all over Europe and also the other countries. And it's based on questioning human rights, is questioning the rights of women as part of it, and is questioning the rights of people to live the free life, and it's actually oriented on an extreme rights of those in power to exercise that power. So that's the second thing. And the third point that I would like to make is the point which stress the fact that the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence is not a new thing. We actually, it's very characteristic that the two articles which are strongly combat by governments which are against this convention are the first one is talking about gender as the name, and that is related to the religion movements inside Europe, which is very Christian oriented and very traditional oriented and conservative oriented. But the second article is talking about actually fighting the negative stereotypes about men and women. And when you take the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination of Women, you will see that these are actually the same text. And the conclusion that I drew out of it is that we have a bigger problem. The problem is that almost all our countries, also the countries which are not European, are member of the CEDAW Convention, and the CEDAW Convention is not implemented properly. And here I see an actual instrument for fighting not only CEDAW Convention to be implemented, but also for Istanbul Convention to be properly interpreted and adjust to the practice. Because what we have in the Istanbul Convention is an elaboration of everything that we have in CEDAW, especially when we take into consideration two facts. 1992 is the moment when the special protocol to CEDAW Convention is stating the fact that the violence against women is a form of discrimination. And then in 2017, which we see that they are elaborating and working on it, we have a further elaboration of the fact that anything that refers to violence against women or in the family is the violence that is not, it cannot be treated as a private matter. So taking all those three, first, to understand that the women's rights were previously treated as formal, which we see also in the AGA works, showing how far the distribution of rights is unequal between men and women still. Second, when we take into consideration the fact that this is not local, it is spreading. Poland is not it's understandable example. We are both having the history of being under Russian influence, and second, being the country perceived as extremely Catholic, which is not totally true, but that's two, of course, make us a point where all those processes are extremely strongly stressed and present. But at the same time, it is also the country when those processes are opposed by the strong women movement. So that is this kind of a working field for both sides. But the third thing, which I think is extremely important, is the space where we can and we should stress the fact that all the rights that we talk about within the Istanbul Convention are already part of the CEDAW Convention. So demand to implement the CEDAW Convention is the road to also demand for the implementation of the Istanbul Convention. I would stop here because my 5 minutes are over.
Yeah, thank you for stressing three very important points and also linking it to the global development that is very important. We now go to Helsinki. Mariana, if you
Yes, thanks very much. And thank you, Carolina, for assembling the special issue, which I thought was a long time overdue as a legal issue. And I was very happy to participate, although I I was writing that material, how Russia does not participate in Istanbul Convention, right? So you have that focus on Istanbul Convention and resistance of those countries that actually signed that convention and even ratified that, and after ratification had a criticism or had a difficult path towards or around ratification. Well, actually, Russia was a simple case. Russia did not sign and did not ratify Istanbul Convention. At the time, 2011, when the convention was released, Russia already announced that it wasn't going to sign. 2014, when the convention was due to ratification, Russia became a bit more visible in not sort of ratifying, but also it became a bit more visible in its stance of trying to organize other Eastern European, first of all, countries or other members of the Council of Europe. We need to remember that there are countries such as Armenia, for example, Azerbaijan, Georgia, that are members of the Council of Europe, but not technically Europe, right? So in the sense that those countries usually get overlooked in the discussion of Istanbul Convention. So Russia sort of organized what at the time they thought was a natural sphere of influence, post-Soviet countries, post-communist countries, and used quite a old way of doing that. So mobilized the most important resource, that was cultural mobilization. And in my article, I actually show how the concept of cultural sovereignty was used and exported to other countries to stir and stimulate that debate around what Monica mentioned, two important articles. One article, of course, everybody mentioned is the concept of gender. And so to create that idea around that gender is not a culturally natural phenomenon to this country, and therefore, because culturally gender is not a part of Eastern European or whatever development, therefore we cannot ratify the convention because at least it's something that is culturally alien to these countries. I also would refer to Monica when Monica said that Istanbul Convention, in fact, wasn't anything really new, although the convention was a better instrument than CEDAW and than the declaration of the UN Declaration on Violence, on combating violence against women. But at the same time, it was interesting to see how sort of Russia played that double game. While if you look at the national legislation, especially at the executive legislation, that's how Russia deals with domestic violence. So there's nothing in legislation per se. So women who go through domestic violence, or other family members, in fact, who or survivors of domestic violence, family violence, they need to use what we call general articles of the criminal code to protect themselves. So there's basically nothing specific about family violence in the legislation. But at the same level, at the executive level, so what is called policy papers and special programs of the Ministry of Justice, there's a lot of, on behalf of the instructions of the police or the national strategy in the interest of women, documents like that, they actually do focus on the instruments of prevention, what they call the prevention of domestic violence. And so in a sense, those instruments, if you actually look at them closely, and again, I talk a little bit about it in my article, they absolutely are consistent with both CEDAW and Istanbul Convention. So technically, if you look at it, there shouldn't have been no resistance on behalf of Russia to actually adopt, sign and ratify Istanbul Convention, but there's nothing that Russia hasn't done, although it shouldn't have been done if ratified the Istanbul Convention, then there shouldn't have been changes to the criminal code, at least. And that's the minimum level due to the requirement of articles like 26, 27 to introduce a specific crime into the code. But Russia wasn't the only country that did not have that specific legislation when Istanbul Convention, of course, was in progress, Germany was one of those countries that also didn't have a specialized crime, but then Germany sort of also, there was a debate, Carolina here, of course, even better place than me, but it was a specialized debate in Germany, legal debate, how do you change the legislation to introduce the family violence or the domestic violence into the criminal code. So in a sense, it was interesting to me to show in this article that the whole resistance to sign and ratify Istanbul Convention wasn't actually about domestic violence per se, or thinking that domestic violence is not important, or thinking even that it shouldn't have been a part of the agenda, because it is inside the country. And again, I'm in a minority of those scholars who actually highlight that there are instruments of combating domestic violence in Russia versus those who say that there are no instruments, but that's a different debate, right? But in my point of view, there was a lot on behalf of Russia to use the Istanbul Convention, also to show with the Istanbul Convention the way to defy Council of Europe and international institutions. That it was something that at the time was overlooked, because on a surface, Russia continued to ratify and at least comply with other Council of Europe conventions, but not the important ones. And then in my research, I was highlighted that if you don't ratify and openly invoke cultural discourse and cultural sovereignty discourse over such a pretty much simple legal matter as domestic violence, especially for Russians with the Soviet heritage, there's something going on there. And so I introduced the other concept in this article, the concept of conservative jurisprudence, in a sense that how judges and the judges at the Constitutional Court employ the concept of cultural context and a very narrow specification or interpretation of the Norman law to, in fact, not introduce the legislation that contradicts what they think is a narrow interpretation of the constitution and the constitutional tradition. And that's what happened with the Istanbul Convention and with other international documents, especially around 14. That was particularly obvious when the Constitutional Court started saying that Russian constitution has a priority over international legislation, while the constitution per se still there, despite all the changes, still says that if there's a gap in legislation, international law should fill that gap. So the story with Istanbul Convention and Russia, in fact, is the story of those, a little bit of science when we should have noticed, we should have paid attention before as lawyers, as human rights lawyers, but nobody wanted to because it was just a convention on domestic violence, right, against women. And I agree with Monica here that nobody gives a damn, basically, at that level. Now we know that it was a very consistent attempt to defy legislation, any type of legislation that came with a gender-sensitive focus. Since the 90s, none of the pieces of legislation that went to at any point of Russian parliament was in fact passed through the lower house of the parliament, through Duma. There was a gender equality law. There was several specialized laws on domestic violence that's usually called the Prevention of Family Domestic Violence legislation. There was at least 5 attempts since 95. None of those attempts ended up successfully. And in a sense, again, it shows that because those usually these pieces of legislation were generated after Russia promised at the international level to deal with the problem of domestic violence. So we're going to defy, yes, we're going to comply with the recommendations of the CEDAW committee after the whatever periodic report, or yes, we're members of the Council of Europe, should comply, because they all came from the international sort of level of recommendations. It was the small steps of defiance, like we're not going to do that, we're not going to do that, because why? And the other, of course, problem is that, again, highlights the Russian attitude to that human rights of women and domestic violence are 2 different issues. So the human rights, the domestic violence is not seen as a human rights of women issue. It's still by the authorities. So I just put it this way. It's still seen as the social problem issue. And again, the resistance of the authorities and the whole ruckus around it and what we call the traditional criminology around it want to continue with the social problem issue rather than put this problem into the human rights issue. Because of course, in this too, these are different instruments, different levels of recognition, and different ways of dealing with this problem. They are okay at a social problem level. So there's a lot of programs to deal with it because men get drunk and beat up their wives, right? So we know that. But if you go to the human rights of women issue, obviously, as we know from the Istanbul Convention and other human rights documents, then you need to introduce a totally different mechanism and legislative tool and use different concepts of protecting survivors of family and domestic violence. So that would be, my sort of analysis of the Russia's involvement in the Istanbul Convention. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, indeed, Russia early on declared that it does not intend to ratify, but the story here, the story of non-implementation or non-ratification is much more interesting than any other stories, and the story, from that moment the story began, and that is thank you very much for that. Yeah, let's now move on to the perspective on Hungary, if you would like to, or to, yeah.
So it's our turn now. Thank you so much, Caroline, for this invitation and for organizing this talk about our special issue. We would like to take the opportunity to congratulate you and the authors, all of us, obviously, on this wonderful work and also on this workshop. So I'm going to talk about what we did in the article and why and how we did it. And then I will mention some takeaways. And then Lydia will address questions and comments, and we'll talk about the latest developments. So this would be our division of work for today. So as you know, the title of our paper is the non-ratification of the Istanbul Convention by Hungary, lessons to be learned. Lydia and I have focused on the erosion of the consensus around the Istanbul Convention due to the political obstacles to its ratification process, in particular member states, EU member states. We warn in our article that a black and white approach does not assist in understanding the situation. Instead of conceptualizing the rejection of the convention as a backlash phenomenon, we offer a more nuanced analysis. We felt it necessary for two reasons. The first is the ongoing EU legislative project in the field of combating gender-based violence. And the other reason is our belief that the analysis of the Hungarian discourse may contribute to understanding the criticism towards the convention and, as a consequential effect, facilitate the EU's legislative efforts in the relevant field. So in our paper, first, we have identified four main types of concerns regarding the convention on the international level. And these are the conservative, libertarian, across the aisle, anti-feminist, and mainstream feminist concerns. Second, we have detected the prevalence of these types of concerns in the Hungarian discourse. Hungary provides an essential case study. First, because it is a non-ratifying state and an opponent of the EU ratification plan. Second, because we see an emergence of an additional, rather Hungarian-specific concern related to the issue of migration and asylum, which is connected to the use of the term gender. In the political discourse and in the context of the Istanbul Convention, this term is deliberatively and misleadingly used in its meaning of gender identity, as opposed to the obvious intention of the wording of the convention itself, defining gender as a social construct. So now about the takeaways. So maybe one of the most important takeaways in this context is that the anti-gender ideology concern fuels populist arguments under the pretense of being a conservative concern. Moreover, it also supports national particularities, such as the Hungarian anti-immigration argument. The second takeaway could be that if there is a genuine intention to eliminate violence against women and domestic violence, the EU shall be open to compromises. For example, what to think about it. We may note that the wording of the Istanbul Convention's anti-discrimination clause apparently opened avenues for controversy. If these traps are not avoided, the Istanbul Convention 2.0 version project will be endangered or at least severely hindered, depending on the blackmailing capacity of the opponents of this convention. So that would be the brief summary of our paper. Those who have already read it, it is enough. And for those who have not read it, maybe it is an interesting introduction, so they will get some time and start reading our paper. So thank you so much for your attention. And as I said, we are looking forward to your comments and questions, and please address those to Lydia, who will take over from me from now on. Thank you very much.
If I may just add a few sentences, if we still have the time. So we concluded that the EU plans are very, so we are watching these developments stressfully, because the EU's proposed violence against women directive is still in the form of a proposal, so it's not finalized yet. But the Hungarian government has not reacted to this proposal yet, but it may happen anytime. So that will be another phase of this story. I mean, the new part of this story with the non-ratification of the Istanbul Convention. And yeah, just one more comment on this, that we have to be aware that so it's not just the gender and gender ideology, whatever we call it, may be an issue with regard to this planned or proposed directive, or with the content of the Istanbul Convention as well. But there are also these traditional controversial issues, like for example, the definition of rape based on the lack of consent, and which was an issue even in Germany, as I remember. So it's not so obvious that every part of the world is so that it's accepted. And for example, that's an issue in terms of the Hungarian criminal code. And I participated in a mapping project with regards to the proposed EU legislation, and that's one of the shortcomings of the Hungarian legislation. And what happened, just on Tuesday, Hungary received a concluding observation from the CEDAW committee on its 9th periodic report. So it's an official document, and we just discussed it with the experts yesterday and today morning, and we realized that there are a lot of misinformation in this document compiled by the CEDAW. For example, they congratulate the Hungarian government for the positive steps, for example, for introducing this new definition based on the lack of consent with regards to rape into the penal code, which is not true. I don't know where did they get, and there are other misinformations in the CEDAW concluding observations as well. So I'm really like that. So, and we are in the middle of this EU proposal issue. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And we move on to Sveta, who also talks a lot about misinformation, right, and misunderstandings in her article, and misunderstandings between the Council of Europe and the Bulgarian side, or deliberate misunderstandings. And we also have in the journal a translation of the decision of the Bulgarian Constitutional Court on the Istanbul Convention. Just wanted to mention that for you. I have it there. That is additional explanation for what you are saying in your article, Radosveta.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Carolina, for giving me an opportunity to shed light on Bulgaria's challenges. Bulgaria's case is indeed specific because in 2018, the Constitutional Court delivered a blow on the Istanbul Convention, because it handed down a peculiar judgment declaring that the convention was incompliant with Bulgaria's constitution. So in my article, I explored the reasons why this attack against the convention is just surprising and unexpected. And I also discussed the repercussions of this decision, because we're currently faced with the legal impossibility to ratify the Istanbul Convention because of the authority of res judicata. So I compare what happened in Bulgaria to a perfect storm. And the definition of a perfect storm I use is a critical or disastrous situation created by a powerful concurrence of factors. So in Bulgaria, the Istanbul Convention is not a mere victim of populism. I argue that what happened is actually an emanation of the rule of law decay in the country. And I think that you would see this more clearly if you have more context. So first of all, timing is everything. So Bulgaria signed the convention in 2016. Meanwhile, the public assault in the media on the convention started 2 years later. And this is not accidental because in Bulgaria, we don't really have media freedom. So you can suspect that this attack was coordinated with the government. Also, the moment when the attack started is important because this is when Boyko Borisov, our former prime minister, was leading his third government. And this was a coalition with 3 far-right parties, heavily committed to patriarchal values. Then you have another aspect which is not coincidental. In response to this media attack, which they induced themselves, they organized a very peculiar debate in Bulgaria's parliament, where all arguments advanced were developed by obscure conservative groups and church representatives. And this is quite surprising because prior to this, the Bulgarian church had actually publicly supported the Istanbul Convention. All of a sudden, you have this 180-degree turn, which can be explained with the fact that some Bulgarian priests have a history of flirting with politics. So they just did a political favor. And then another aspect here, which is not coincidental, is that in response to this rather strange debate in parliament, 75 members from Borisov's party seized the constitutional court and asked it to review compliance with Bulgaria's constitution. This is also peculiar because in my related work on the rule of law and the rule of law decay in Bulgaria, I have consistently shown how Borisov's governments were never concerned with compliance of the constitution. Rather, they were concerned with undermining the constitution. What happened here is that they actually crafted a very smart trap for the convention. And this constitutional court that we have in Bulgaria has specifics which make it the perfect venue to attack and undermine any international legal instrument. So first of all, it has the monopoly on constitutional interpretation, then it can be seized by very few entities. And third, it's a very political, heavily politicized court. So I've explained this in detail, but because of the way judges are appointed to this court, they could owe political favors afterwards. And even in the decision itself, we have 3 dissenting opinions signed by 4 judges. All of them overtly admit the majority was influenced by politics and by the media hysteria. So we even have insights from judges from the court about what happened. And I extensively analyzed the strange reasoning of the decision itself. I find it problematic and convincing, and that's why we have 3 dissenting opinions. What's really troublesome is that they really struggled to show in compliance, and the device that they used in the end was just imputing meaning to Bulgaria's constitution, which is not there. For instance, they relied on a specific article concerning the rights of children. So this is an article ensuring that the rights of children are respected. And among their rights, it is mentioned that obstetric care is free in Bulgaria. And based on this very specific article, the court concluded that the social role of women was to give biological birth, which is not the intended meaning of this article. But also, what about women who haven't given biological birth? What about mothers who have become mothers by adopting, for instance? In the eyes of the court, they're not women from a social perspective. And this is how they construed this clash with the Istanbul Convention. The sad reality is that after this decision, we have drastic consequences. This decision is binding, it cannot be reversed, and it has closed the door to ratification, as I had mentioned. If we are to ratify the convention, we have to modify the constitution, but because of the way they explain this clash between the convention and the constitution, it's unclear it's unclear what should be modified. And even worse, this decision has put constraints on other courts because it's now binding on all other courts. And as a result of it, we have a plethora of judgments by other courts, even by the Supreme Court of Cassation, that are severely curtailing the interpretation of women's rights in Bulgaria. So at the end of the paper, I have explained what could be done. So I have suggested that the more realistic solution would be introducing the non-contested provisions of the convention through the back door, for instance, through piecemeal legislation modification of the laws in Bulgaria. And also another sad outcome is that if there is an EU instrument introducing the Istanbul Convention at a later stage, that would be it would be in a direct clash with Bulgaria's legal order, because in Bulgaria, our constitution declares that the constitution is the supreme law of our country, and only our constitutional court can interpret the constitution. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much also for looking on the question of what could be done. Yeah, it's interesting that the decision of the Bulgarian Constitutional Court became an important point of reference even in other countries, as I understood in Hungary. In Hungary, it was also cited and a reference point in the discussion. Yeah, we for our discussion now have another 20 minutes or 15 to 20 minutes, and I would immediately ask the audience to comment on what you have heard and what you have read and ask questions to our speakers and the other authors that are in the room who would like to start. And otherwise, I would also invite the speakers to comment on the other papers. But there definitely is someone who would like to start. No one.
Maybe I can start just, to open the floor with a question. I think that the question of church involvement is very important, and especially because in Bulgaria there were rumors that there was Russian influence and Russian interference in the Bulgarian church that made it alter its position. So I think that in general this would be an interesting issue to explore and discuss in the future, the reasons that actually motivate the church to be so active and vocal against the Istanbul Convention, because as I said, in Bulgaria, our church initially formally endorsed the convention. So
may I reflect a little bit on this? Thank you, Radasveta, for bringing this up. And what I keep actually saying, and that's in relation to the involvement of Russian Orthodox Church into other discussions, like, for example, in Armenia or Georgia, these two countries also had quite a big debate around the Istanbul Convention. The idea is that the Russian church actually made everything and basically influenced Bulgarian church or Ukrainian church or Moldovan, for that matter, part of the church, and that's why that happened. That was this stir. I think in this issue, and when I was reading the articles and yours as well, what I was glad to see that in fact, while the church is definitely an important actor, but Russian Orthodox Church is actually not it. That's the problem. It basically jumped on the bandwagon, but it already happened. And the other churches were leading before, in fact, Russian Orthodox Church ever joined to that or ever started, in fact, interfering with the other context. Russian Orthodox Church does have on paper a lot of power, but in reality, actually, it doesn't, because this country is still not religious, and that is the problem. Which, you know, a lot of it is underestimated, because it's such an easy thing to go and say, oh, look, they claimed the ban on abortion, you know, that must have been the church. Yes, it must have been the church, but the ban on abortion didn't happen, and it didn't happen 2 months ago, which is, in the middle of the war, you have to ban an abortion, right? If you want women to give you more soldiers, right? That's what you should do. And yeah, the very conservative woman stands up and says, well, you know what, it's all right to have an abortion, we're not going to do that. And that's contrary to what the patriarch and whatever the church said. So this relationship, so what I'm saying, and I agree with Radoslava's also material on that, this relationship is much more problematic and complicated than just to blame it on the church. I put it this way. Others, and my Ukrainian colleague as well as my Armenian colleague once, Marina Shevtsova and Liana Osoria said once, we don't need any help from the Russians actually to have our own mess, you know, that's the problem. But Russians are very good in meddling into this mess and creating this mess and using and abusing this mess basically to their own advantage. So I'd be very careful to create that blame onto whatever church or whatever other circumstances. In every one of these countries, Bulgaria, Hungary, Russia, Moldova, Ukraine, and Ukraine ratified Istanbul Convention now due to the war, of course, but due to whatever other circumstances. Armenia, that did not ratify. Azerbaijan, that did ratify. You know, if you look at the circumstances of ratification and the circumstances of this debate around domestic violence legislation, Istanbul Convention, are quite unique, and we needn't to forget about it and not be very careful when we go on a intra level or a supra level and say, oh, it's all about Eastern Europe, or it's all about these people. There are no these people, basically. We need to be very careful to actually take into account the local problems as well.
Thank you. Monica, please.
I would like probably to add to what Marianne already said, but I would start from another angle. It is this Gabrielle Kubi, and there is this story of her coming to the Pope and talking about this extreme danger of gender. And of course, it is part of it. But as I mentioned, from the report of Neil Data, the roots comes from 1960s in Brazil, and the organization that is for New Order. And the New Order declares the family that we traditionally known, with the men on top of it. And it's against the idea that people can have the families of their own choice. And it is very much against the same-sex marriages. And we can see the repeat arguments in Bulgaria, as well as in Poland and in many other countries, that this convention will give a possibility to same-sex marriage, although there is not a single word about it in that convention. Plus, in this convention, it is stated that this convention is against traditional negative view of male and female within the family. And that also is an attack of it. So I think that to some extent, those people who are combined, no matter what kind of religion they represent, but who see that religion is part of the way we govern and create a hierarchical order within the state and within the family, with ability to question human rights, which means ability to question rights of individual to have the sphere where they decide about themselves and where they are not put into slavery, in many respects slavery again. This is where the combination between religion and money and conservative ideas get together. So it is specifically extremely visible in Poland, of course, but I would agree that even if we would exclude church, which doesn't want to be excluded, and even if we would say it doesn't matter how far the church influenced with the politics, although it does influence with politics, and it is the combination between those in power and the church, and the belief of those in power that they have to rely on church in order to keep the power, that this is not the major issue. But I would also like to ask the question, because what I heard from Radosveta, it sounds for me like the attack on the convention is actually an introduction on the attack of in vitro possibilities and the rights of women, of reproductive rights, of whatever reproductive rights. And that is also present in Poland. And of course, if this would be a case in Poland, it's not the situation that we are stuck. We really don't have a real constitutional court right now, but isn't it that someone can brought again the case to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court can change their opinion? They can come to the conclusion that the opinion they have previously was wrong, right? And I would state it that this is wrong based on the fact that, first of all, women are not obliged to have children. Second, the different reproductive possibilities might give a chance for women to have babies if they want to, also by other means than this natural way. Well, by other means, I mean, for example, adoption or in vitro. And it doesn't take away their meaning and the value as female. So you probably have a lot of possibilities to question the decision of the Constitutional Court and to give chance to the Constitutional Court to change their opinion if the political atmosphere would change. I'm finishing because I see that Barbara Grabowska wants to speak, but I think that we have to see the broader picture. What's happening with convention, although it is within the Europe, it's not stopped with Europe. And even in Europe, when you see the development in the Netherlands, in Spain, we can see that those tendencies are spreading, including even Norway, although it's not in the European Union. And yeah, well, I would stop here.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, please. We will get back to the question on reproductive rights, but we will, please, Barbara Grabowska.
Thank you. My name is Barbara Grabowska-Moros. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
I'm affiliated with CUDI in Budapest, and I'm currently working on Istanbul Convention from the activism perspective. And I'm wondering, this is a question to Timea, Lydia, and Radosveta. How do you think, what was the role of this famous or infamous FRA report from 2014 or 13 about the gender violence in Europe? There was a huge survey done in all EU member states. What was the narrative about this this report? How the data from the report were used and presented in the narrative? Because I know how it was in Poland. It basically was told, look, there is no domestic violence in Poland because even women in anonymous surveys, they said they are not victims of domestic violence. Look at Sweden, look at Scandinavia. There are so many women reporting about domestic violence, even in the surveys. So the data from the social science adopted, in sociological, sorry, I'm at the airport. They were abused and presented against the Istanbul Convention. So how was it used in Bulgaria and Hungary? My second question goes to Professor Płatek about Grevio and about the report from Grevio from 2021. There was this big argument against Grevio that this is going to, undermine the Polish sovereignty because we have to report to independent body. Now we have the report from Grevio. What's the added value of the report? What has changed? What was the reaction of the government? Has it introduced and caused any changes, in the field in law, or maybe it was a disappointment. What do you think about the report and the reactions? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Radosveta, do you want to?
Sure. Well, in Bulgaria, the situation maybe is slightly more specific because in Bulgarian media, you have plenty of statistics on violence against women, and all of them are quite worrisome. The latest figure I saw was that at least one third of Bulgarian women have been subjected to violence in their life. This is like from earlier this year. The problem is that many Bulgarians consider that these are family issues that should be resolved within the family. And this is, I guess, the narrative exploited by those opposing the convention. See, we know that there is a problem. We feel bad for these women, but this is something that should be resolved elsewhere. So I think that you have somewhat of a paradox, if you wish, in Bulgaria. Thank you very much.
So if I may add, I can say something about the FRA report. And so as I remember, so you mentioned it was published in 2014. Was it the year?
13 or 14, I remember.
13 or 14, yeah. So anyway, by the time I was actively working with human rights organizations and women's organizations, and as I remember, we used the data, and the data, the statistics were more or less the same as the average, if I may say, in Europe. So it was not significantly worse or better. And we use that the data for advocacy purposes, but it was basically the time when Hungary signed the Istanbul Convention. So it was like, okay, so it's so good that we will have the Istanbul Convention because we have this situation, but it will improve the situation, and that's all. So by that time, there was no anti-Istanbul Convention debate or discourse in Hungary. And then soon the data became obsolete, or how may I say? And we have, so that's what I can add. So it was not so important in this story.
And if I may, two remarks. First of all, I wouldn't call this report infamous on the number of violence in different countries, because actually this is how the government tried to present the data, that look, there is nothing in Poland and in other Eastern European countries. Sweden has a problem. So giving women rights makes it really problematic. They shouldn't have it as much. And it didn't work, because very quickly we could prove actually that the definition of violence within the convention and within the legal order that we have in the country is not fitted to each other, and that economic violence, actually even sexual violence, is something that we do not recognize, we do not see it. Second, it was also very quickly proved that it is rather the lack of information and lack of proper action taken by first of all, the victim themselves, second, by the units which are responsible for dealing with violence. So I wouldn't treat it badly. I would rather treat it as an evidence that in the country where violence is treated seriously, you have a lot of data on it. In countries where you try to squish it and not talk about it, the data pretend that everything is okay. Now, when it comes to Grevio, yes, the fact that Grevio exists was and is a very strong argument that no one should interfere with our matters. It might change a little bit once we have our own representatives within Grevio from Poland. But I think that many might not agree with me, but the results are paradoxical, because we have a government which is really anti-human rights, and it's a government that is trying to reestablish the oligarchic state, conservative state, and a state which does not fulfill the obligation that are in the constitution. And therefore, they are using the Grevio report on changing the law in the way which is fulfilling the state policy. Just an example, we have right now the law on fighting with domestic violence from 2005, then this law is far from being perfect, but it's talking about domestic, the violence within the family. Now, this is used as an argument to change the name of the law, because the family is supposed to be something that is very special and very unique. So it's called domestic violence. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that this is just Grevio. It's part of the Grevio, but much more of the people activities and the NGOs activities to change the present situation. We do have two other elements. First of all, that you might include other people than just member of the family within the scope of interest when the violence is present. That's important, I think. Second, we have at the end the possibility to not evict, but to ask the person that is violent to leave the place for certain days. So something that was in Austria in the 90s already, we had to fight for it almost 30 years to get it. If this is part of Grevio report, then it is fine. But I do accept that you might have probably more observation on it. And I do have to study far more what's happening. And the truth is, I have an impression that the state did utmost everything that is possible not to talk about the report itself and to use those arguments which are suited for them to change the law, to evict the family from the even mentioning in the law in relation to violence.
Yeah, thank you very much. And there were also some very helpful comments in the chat. Please have a look on here. There were a couple of useful links and comments that you probably all have seen already. So yes, thank you very much. We stop here, but of course the discussion obviously does not stop. We hope that we could add a little regional perspective on that global phenomenon. And we hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much again to the authors for your brilliant papers that we could include into that issue. And yeah, please have a look on the links and recommendations, and I hope we will meet again soon. All the best for today.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.